St. Petersburg, December 1849. Snow blankets the square, and the cold cuts through faces like knives. 8 in the morning, yet the sky remains dark, as if the sun decided to be late today. A row of men stand in the snow, hands bound behind their backs, eyes blindfolded with rough cloth. Before them, a firing squad. Behind them, the lives they once had. One of them is 28 years old, thin, pale, trembling, but not only from the cold. 3 days ago, he was sitting in his small room, writing, reviewing ideas, dreaming of novels not yet written. Now, he stands seconds away from death, hearing the soldiers' boots crunching on the snow, smelling gunpowder in the freezing air. The officer raises his hand. The soldiers raise their rifles. And the man thinks, not of escape, not of screaming, not of regret. He thinks of one question only. What should I have done with the time I was given? Then, everything stopped. A horseman arrives from afar, waving his hand, shouting a single word. The soldiers slowly lower their rifles. A heavy silence fills the square. Then, a single voice reads from an official document, the Tsar's pardon. That thin, pale man did not die that day, but he never lived the same way again.
His name is Fyodor Dostoevsky. And this is not the story of a writer who survived execution. This is the story of a soul that entered death through its front door and came out carrying what only those who have truly lived it can carry, the deepest secrets of the human soul. But to understand what brought him to that snowy square, and to understand why that precise moment created the greatest writer in history, we must go back to the beginning, to a place where greatness is not usually born. Moscow, November 1821. Not in a palace, not in a wealthy home, not even in a respectable neighborhood. In a hospital for the poor, where his father worked as a doctor, earning a modest wage, serving those who could not afford treatment. The father, Mikhail Dostoevsky, a stern and harsh man, a believer in order, discipline, and punishment. A self-made man, which made him intolerant of weakness or failure. The mother, Maria, a woman from a completely different world, gentle, warm, a lover of literature who read to her children before bed, told them old stories and sang them folk songs.
Young Fyodor fell asleep to the stories his mother told, and woke to the cries of patients outside the window pane. From childhood, he lived between two worlds. The world of beauty his mother created with her voice and words, and the world of pain he witnessed every day through the window pane. This tension between beauty and pain would never leave him. It would become the raw material for everything he would ever write. By the age of 10, Fyodor was reading with an appetite unnatural for a child his age. Pushkin, Karamzin, Russian history, folk tales. He devoured words as if he knew he would need them someday. At 15, something happened that changed everything. His mother died of tuberculosis. Fyodor, who had found shelter, warmth, and meaning in her voice, suddenly found himself in a much colder world.
The father, who had always been stern, became harsher still, perhaps drinking more isolated from his children. And the child, who had lived between two worlds, found that the beautiful world had suddenly vanished, leaving only the harsh one behind. A few years later, the father died too, in circumstances still debated to this day. The story goes that his serfs killed him in revenge for his cruel treatment of them.
Young Fyodor heard the news and suffered his first epileptic seizure, as if his body could not bear the shock and collapsed in its own way. The illness that would accompany him all his life, sometimes transforming into visions and sensations impossible to describe. But the mind was recording everything. Every pain, every loss, every unanswered question. His father had sent him before his death to the Military Engineering Academy in St. Petersburg. A clear path, a secure future, an organized life within the framework of the Tsarist state. But Fyodor did not see engineering equations when he looked at the page. He saw characters, voices, people living inside his head who wanted to come out. At night, while his classmates slept, exhausted from the day's drills, he read. Pushkin, whose poetry he knew by heart. Shakespeare, who amazed him with his depth of understanding of the human soul. Homer, Schiller, Hugo. He devoured world literature the way a starving man devours bread. And after graduating from the academy, he did what shocked everyone who knew him. He resigned from the army in less than a year. He decided to write. Only to write. He had no money, no name or connections, no security of any kind. But he carried one irresistible thing, a burning need to say something worth saying. St. Petersburg in the mid-19th century was a city of glaring contradictions. Palaces glittering with chandelier light where opera played, and mere meters away, neighborhoods where entire families crowded into a single damp, dark room. An aristocracy that prided itself on speaking French and importing its clothes from Paris, and a people who could not afford their daily bread. The Tsarist regime silently crushed any voice that dared demand change. But beneath this polished surface, Russia was boiling. Young intellectuals were gathering in secret, reading European thinkers, debating Feuerbach and Saint Simon, dreaming of a different world. And young Fyodor was one of them. In 1845, he wrote his first novel at 24 years of age. Poor Folk. Letters exchanged between a simple 60-year-old government clerk trying to help a desperate young woman suffering from poverty and loneliness. No heroes, no glory, no adventures. Just an ordinary man trying to preserve his dignity and humanity in a world that sees him only as a file number. He sent the manuscript to his friend, the poet Nekrasov, who passed it to the most celebrated literary critic in all of Russia, Belinsky. Belinsky read it in a single night, without stopping. And early the next morning, he sent word to Nekrasov. Who is this young man? Do you know what he has written? Does he realize the magnitude of what he has done? Belinsky, the man whose criticism could break careers and whose praise could create stars, gathered his friends and said aloud, "A new Gogol has been born among us." And overnight, young Fyodor Dostoevsky, the penniless writer living in a small rented room, became a star in the Russian literary firmament. St. Petersburg in the mid-19th century was a city of glaring contradictions. Palaces glittering with chandelier light where opera played, and mere meters away, neighborhoods where entire families crowded into a single damp, dark room. An aristocracy that prided itself on speaking French and importing its clothes from Paris, and a people who could not afford their daily bread. The Tsarist regime silently crushed any voice that dared demand change. But beneath this polished surface, Russia was boiling. Young intellectuals were gathering in secret, reading European thinkers,
debating Feuerbach and St. Simon, dreaming of a different world. And young Fyodor was one of them.
In 1847, Dostoevsky joined a secret group, the Petrushevsky Circle, a gathering of young intellectuals who met every Friday at the home of a man named Mikhail Petrushevsky. They read the ideas of European socialist thinkers, debated the abolition of serfdom that kept millions of Russian peasants in legal bondage, and dreamed of a Russia that respected human dignity. They carried no weapons. They were not plotting an armed revolution. They were reading and talking and writing. But in Tsarist Russia under Nicholas I, the man who believed free thought was the most dangerous weapon of all, words were more dangerous than bullets. A secret agent infiltrated the group, recorded everything that was said, and filed his reports with the secret police. In April 1849, at 4 a.m, there was a knock at the door. Dostoevsky opened it to find a secret police officer and a number of soldiers. He and all members of the circle were arrested and thrown into the dreaded Peter and Paul fortress. That fortress, whose thick walls on the frozen banks of the Neva River meant to every Russian near permanent oblivion. 8 months of waiting. 8 months without a real trial, without clear answers, without natural light except what filtered through a narrow crack high in the wall. Then came the verdict. Execution. December 1849. The Semyonovsky Square in St. Petersburg. 20 defendants lined up in the snow, wearing white execution shirts over their cold clothes. Dostoevsky stood in the front row. He later recounted that he looked at his companion beside him, Mumbeli, and they exchanged a long look. No words, just a look, as if bidding each other farewell in silence, wondering without speaking, what could have been? What had they not yet accomplished? What were they leaving behind? The priest came to give them their last rites. Then the execution order was read aloud. The first 3 were tied to the post, black hoods placed over their heads. Dostoevsky was in the second group, waiting his turn, counting the seconds. Then at the last moment, before the soldiers in front of him fired, a horseman arrived at speed carrying a document bearing the Tsar's seal. Everything stopped. Silence. Then an officer's voice reading, "The imperial pardon. The death sentence is commuted to hard labor in Siberia." But the shock had already struck. One of the defendants lost his mind in that moment and never recovered it. Others wept like children. As for Dostoevsky, he recounts feeling something in that moment he could not put into words. He felt that every second of his life, every small moment, every beautiful sight he had not noticed, every conversation he had not given its due, every book he had not finished, every feeling he had not lived fully, all of this had been a treasure he did not know the value of. Until now. Until this moment when he realized he had been seconds away from losing it forever. And he was shackled that same night and sent east. In bitter cold, on an open cart cutting through the snow, carrying with him the one thing they allowed him, a copy of the Bible. A gift from a woman he did not know who stood at a station along the road and gave it to him. Omsk, Siberia, the labor camp. 4 years in a place thousands of miles from everything he knew. 4 years with criminals, murderers, thieves, fugitives from justice, outcasts whom life had thrown here. At first, the collision was difficult. Dostoevsky, the educated writer, son of a Moscow doctor, a man of the noble class, found himself suddenly surrounded by men who hated his class instinctively. They refused to mix with him, calling him the noble with a tone of contempt. But Dostoevsky began to observe. He began to notice something the polished intellectual society he had grown up in had never shown him. These men whom society had classified as criminals, beasts, and outcasts carried an entire world within them. The genuine remorse that made a large, frightening man weep at night thinking no one could see him. The unexpected tenderness that appeared when one of them spoke of a child or of his mother. The values that did not appear as values to a society judging from the outside, but had their own internal logic.
Dostoevsky began to understand something dangerous and revolutionary for his time. No human being is entirely evil. No human being is entirely good. Inside every convicted murderer sentenced to hard labor, there is a frightened child. And inside every respectable man in a fine suit who looks with contempt at criminals, there is something he does not dare look at in the mirror. Siberia did not break Dostoevsky. Siberia gave him what no university or literary salon could ever give him: the complete truth about human nature. And there too, in that cold wilderness, his faith deepened in a way he had not expected. But it was not a peaceful or comfortable faith. It was a faith wrestling with doubt at every moment. He read the Bible at night, the only book he was permitted, and would stop at certain passages and ask himself,
why do the innocent suffer? A child born poor and sick in Siberia who did not choose this. Why? If there is divine justice, where is it in this camp? And if there is no justice, how does a human being bear his existence? These questions would never leave him, and they would become the heart of every great novel he would write. In 1854, his sentence at the labor camp ended, but he was not fully freed. He was assigned to compulsory military service in Siberia for additional years as a common soldier. There he married for the first time, a widow named Maria. The marriage was not happy. Both carried deep wounds that would not heal. But during this period, Dostoevsky began writing again, after years of forced silence, as if the pen was the only way he knew how to breathe.
He returned to St. Petersburg in 1859, after 10 full years away. 10 years that in another person's life would have been merely a decade, but in his were a journey to another world and back, with completely different eyes. The city had changed. Literature had changed. The faces had changed. But Dostoevsky returned with something that cannot be bought or acquired except the way he acquired it. He began writing furiously, articles, stories, novels, but his personal life was complete chaos. Money came and went quickly, and he had a dangerous addiction to gambling he could not resist. He would sit at the roulette table and bet everything he had, win a small fortune, and lose it all in the next session. He wrote to friends asking for loans, promising repayment, then lost everything again. Debts piling up, relationships strained, nights waking in terror because creditors were knocking at the door. But from the heart of this complete chaos, from this tremendous pressure and life on the edge, emerged the greatest works he ever wrote. As if the pressure was purifying something inside him, forcing him to reach the core of what he wanted to say, without evasion.
1866. 1 year. 1 novel. Crime and Punishment. Rodion Raskolnikov, a poor student in St. Petersburg, intelligent and arrogant, building a dangerous theory in his mind. Human beings are of two kinds. The first, the herd, ordinary people who live by laws and morality because they can do nothing else. The second, the great ones, Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander, who can transcend morality because their grand objectives justify it. And Raskolnikov believes he is of the second kind. So he kills an elderly female moneylender he considers a parasite sucking the blood of the poor. A perfect crime by logic, a noble aim, a calculated result. But what happens after? The perfect crime collapses before one thing Raskolnikov had not calculated in his theory. Conscience. Not fear of the law, not fear of punishment, but an inner voice that will not be silenced, reminding him of what he did, making every moment of his life charged with unbearable weight. The novel was a sharp philosophical question, like a knife. Can a human being truly transcend morality in the name of an idea? And what happens to his soul when he tries? Dostoevsky knew the answer because he had lived alongside those who had tried the different answers. He had seen in Siberia men who committed crimes that seemed logical to them in the moment. And he had seen what that did to them from within.
That same year, for reasons involving debts and an unjust publishing contract, Dostoevsky was forced to do the impossible. He had to complete a full novel in 1 month or lose the publishing rights to all his works for 10 years. He hired a stenographer named Anna Snitkina, a quiet and hard-working young woman of 21. In 27 days, he dictated the entire novel, The Gambler, to her. And on the last day, when they finished, he looked at Anna differently. He saw in her something he had never seen before in his chaotic life. Steadiness, calm, safety. A young woman who looked at him despite all his chaos and saw something in him worth seeing. He married her, and it was, without doubt, the best decision he made in his entire life. Anna was not merely a wife who shared his home. She was the literary editor who managed the publication of his works. She was the accountant who protected him from his worst gambling impulses. She was the human being who believed in him when everyone else doubted. With her, he finally found what he had been searching for, without knowing he was searching.
Something resembling calm. Something resembling stability. Something that allowed him to write with greater depth because he had somewhere to return to. But the pain did not stop. Their first daughter, Sonia, died just weeks after her birth. Then their second daughter died too. Then their young son, Alyosha, at age 3, from an epileptic seizure. Dostoevsky, who had suffered from epilepsy himself throughout his life, sat beside his son as he died from the same illness that had tormented him. There are no words for such pain. But he wrote. He took the pain and transformed it into art, as the smelter takes his gold from heavy gray raw ore. In the final years of his life, after everything he had endured, he sat and wrote what many consider the greatest novel ever written by a human being. The Brothers Karamazov. One Russian family, containing 3 brothers, representing 3 faces of humanity in its eternal struggle. Ivan, the mind that doubts everything, who sees the tragedy of the innocent and cannot reconcile himself with the idea of a God who permits it. Dmitri, the body that rushes with full force toward life, oscillating between the highest nobility and the deepest degradation. Alyosha,
The soul that has not lost its faith amid all this chaos, that tries to love in a world that makes love difficult. And the entire novel is one question, asked from every possible angle. How does a human being live with all these contradictions inside him simultaneously? How does he believe while doubting? How does he love while suffering? How does he choose when he does not know what is right? At the heart of the novel is one scene, counted among the most famous pages in the history of world literature.
Imagine you could build a paradise on Earth, a world of happiness and justice and peace. But the price is that one innocent little girl must be tortured unbearably. Would you agree? And when Alyosha refuses with difficulty, Ivan says, "Then God should not have accepted it, and I am returning my ticket of admission." Dostoevsky did not answer this question with a direct answer. He was too wise for that. He left the question ringing in the reader's mind, because the question is the truth, not the answer. In January 1881, Dostoevsky was at the pinnacle of his literary glory. The Russian public loved him with a depth that did not resemble mere admiration for a writer. They felt he spoke about them, lived their lives, and said what they themselves could not say. In June 1880, he delivered a speech about the great Russian poet Pushkin that became legendary. He spoke of the Russian people's soul, of the universal human being, of love that transcends borders and religions. He made the audience weep and brought them to their feet in applause in the same moment. Some of those who were there said people were embracing one another from the intensity of what they felt. They said it was the moment Dostoevsky united Russia with his words. But his body was signaling the end, a pulmonary hemorrhage. On the 28th of January, 1881, at the age of 59, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died. At his funeral, more than 50,000 people walked through the streets of St. Petersburg. Not only the nobility and the wealthy, students, workers, women, the elderly, ordinary people who felt that this man had spoken for them. But what did Dostoevsky truly leave us? Not only the novels. He left a question that lives in every word he wrote. How does a human being bear suffering and remain human? He believed something strange for his time, that pain is not an obstacle in the path of life. Pain is the path. That a human being does not know himself except when facing his deepest losses. That the soul is not shaped in times of ease, but in moments of collapse. Friedrich Nietzsche read Dostoevsky and said he was the only real learning he had ever gained from psychology. Freud said The Brothers Karamazov was the greatest novel ever written. Einstein said Dostoevsky gave him more than any scientist ever had. One man, one life filled with pain and chaos and doubt. He emerged from it with the secrets of the human soul in his hands, and he wrote them down, because he knew that one who has survived death has no right to silence. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for all our latest content. You can also find all the sources and references used in this video in the links below the description.